Well, can I just say that I don't know what's been going on, but our worship time has been running long, and so every Sunday we get started a little late. I just want to apologize because it just kind of keeps pushing things back. And so I will trim just a little bit as we go here, but that being said, real fast review. We looked last week at Joseph, and he stepped forward to be a substitute for his brother Benjamin, and that was our study last week. And what we talked about was Judah, as he steps forward, he becomes a type of Christ, because that's exactly what Jesus did for us, is he was our substitute, that he took upon himself our sin. And so as we looked at the story of Judah, Judah has really changed. This is a long ways from the guy it was his idea to sell Joseph, to now here's the one willing to step forward to be a substitute for their youngest brother, their dad's favorite. And so we see that transition in in Judah, and at this point he is a type of Christ. Judah is the one that the line of the kings will come through, and I would say it's because of what God did and how he responded to God's leading. And so as we looked at that, the place we found life, or that I showed, here's where I think God's pointing us to some life in the story, was that we're called to be Christ-like. And if we are going to discover life, then we need to learn how to lay our lives down like we see Judah did. Okay, that's our review, and we'll start from there. It was a busy week this week, and I didn't get a record for putting it online. So, Debbie, we got it going and everything. Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. We're in chapter 45, starting at verse 1. This is the big reveal. Okay, this is the Sunday that's just been sitting out there, and we've been wanting to get to it. So, remember, Judah has just stepped forward and has offered himself in Benjamin's place, and this is where we left off. This is what happens next. Chapter 45, verse 1 says this: Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm Joseph." Now notice the exclamation point there, okay? "I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive?" he says. But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, Lord of his entire household and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says. God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. You, your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded to me in Egypt and about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly.' Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping. And he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him." Okay, we're going to stop there, okay? So that's where we're going to stop. And as we do it, there's more in this passage than we're going to touch. And so if there's more things in there, I just want you to pay attention to them. If they stood out to you, take some time. Let them sink in. Ask some questions, all right? But as we do, here's where we're going to start. Joseph tells his servants leave, okay? So he tells them, "Leave my presence." as I look at that, I'm trying to figure out, well, so what's going on? Why does this need to be the thing that takes place? Why does Joseph not want the servants and the attendants in there when he tells his brothers who he is? Either Joseph didn't want to appear weak before his servants, or his servants had no idea he wasn't an Egyptian. Now let's back up for a minute. When Joseph rose in power, Pharaoh married him to a priest's daughter. Okay, now we were told that for the Egyptians to eat with a Hebrew was detestable. We found that out when Joseph threw a feast for his brothers. And his brothers sat together in one table in order, oldest to youngest. And then the servants, the Egyptians, sat together, and then Joseph sat by himself. And so it's possible that the Egyptians didn't actually know that Joseph was an Egyptian because he was married to a very prominent woman, because it was the daughter of a very significant priest in all of Egypt. And Pharaoh was creating this image, right? And I just have to go there again. I can't help it. Joseph looked like an Egyptian. He dressed like an Egyptian. Yes, he did. He walked like an Egyptian, okay? So, I'm sorry, it just doesn't get old. Okay, so, I'm sorry, we're only going to be, maybe one more time is all I'm going to use it for, okay? Just one more, not today, but I'm going to save it. So there's this, he didn't want to appear weak in front of his servants, but he also didn't want them to find out just yet who he was. But what this does, and here's the really cool thing, what this does is this creates a private moment for the brothers' sin to be exposed. So nobody is in the room when Joseph addresses them, and what's talked about is what they've done. Now, these servants were there for Joseph. If they would have found out Joseph was treated this way, then they would have wanted revenge as well. And so this creates an atmosphere. Joseph creates an atmosphere where this stuff can come to the surface and actually they can work through it without the outside influence. The next thing we see is Joseph wept before he told them who he was. Now just imagine the scene, right? They're sitting there. Judah has just said, hey, take me, make me your slave, and let them go. I don't want to see my father hurt, right? I don't want to see what this would do to my father. And so in the middle of that, Judah has just made that offer, and Joseph's like, everybody out. I wonder what the brothers thought at that point. Well, I kind of think they were probably thinking, uh-oh, this isn't good. And so all the servants leave, and all of a sudden Joseph just breaks down. I wonder if they were just like, what is going on, right? Man, he really must have liked this silver cup a lot. But whatever it is, right, could we at least say this was an emotionally charged moment, especially for Joseph. Why was he weeping? Now, he's a guy, he might not have known why, right? In other words, sometimes we have to figure it out. Well, I don't know I'm crying, but I'm crying. But something is going on, and my question is what is causing this in him? Is he weeping me out of the pain that he went through? And he finally could let it out? Here's what we're told. That Joseph could no longer control himself. So let's back up for a minute. As we see each time he interacted with his brothers, what he's struggling with, he wants to reveal himself to them. And he's holding back. Not that it's something that he necessarily wanted to do, but it's something he felt like he needed to do. But he could no longer keep this in. He could no longer keep it a secret that he was Joseph. Now notice, we just read 15 verses. Joseph actually identifies himself to his brothers 3 times in these 15 verses. If you see something repeated 3 times in 15 verses, you probably should say there's something there. Okay? Oh, he said it again. oh, he's doing it again. So we should probably take a moment and see what is there. So those 3 times, each time is a little bit different. It seems easy to interpret that as the brothers hear this information, they are so dumbfounded that they're struggling to believe what they've heard. But it's also likely that as it was kind of settling in, it was work for Joseph to be acting, to keep this image up so that they didn't figure it out. Now, I admit that I've always kind of thought that he wept because he was finally able to talk about what happened. That he was just finally like, yes, I can let it out now. But he doesn't talk to them about the things that they've done or the pain that it caused him. He wanted them to know who he was. He wanted there to be a repair in the relationship. Look what he says. Right after he says, I'm Joseph, what does he say? Is my father still alive? What's the most important thing? After he introduces himself, what's the most important thing? That's what he's going to ask about. He doesn't say, I'm Joseph, and you guys are so in trouble. Okay? I'm Joseph, it's payback time now. He says, I'm Joseph, is my father still alive? This matters. Hey, you told me he's still alive, but I want to know, now that you know who I am, I want to know, is he still alive? And then he says, I want to take care of you. There is no indication that Joseph is struggling to contain himself because of his wounds, but because he sees how God has taken all the bad he went through and all that his brothers did against him and has made something good out of it. He's got good news. What he's excited about is he gets to actually tell them, hey, it's not about what you've done to me. It's look what God's done. Look where I'm at, and look what God's done and he's got a purpose for it. And so he's excited to tell them. He's emotional about it. He could finally connect with his brother Benjamin, with the rest of his brothers again, and with his dad. That he can finally use his power and position to do what he wants to with it. Do you think he was like, I'm just loving this in this position so I can take care of Egypt? No. He's excited that he sees, I'm in this position because God wants me to take care of my family. Being the second in command of Egypt gave him just about everything he could have ever wanted, except what he really wanted to do was be reunited with his brothers and his father. And he is bursting at the seams to share with his brothers. And he couldn't hold it back any longer. Not just an emotion, but that he can reveal himself, that he can tell them who he is. And what happens is a bunch of nosy servants were outside the room with their ear to the door. Okay, it doesn't say that, right? But they heard him. The Egyptians heard him crying, weeping, wailing. And then what'd they do? Look, gossip happens back then too, right? Because they told Pharaoh's household. It's a story that's quickly spread. Something's going on in Joseph's house. So Joseph identifies himself with his brothers. Everybody's left. He identifies himself. And the first one is this: I am Joseph. It's real simple, right? Not complicated, not complicated identification, just I'm Joseph. And as I said a moment ago, there's 3 times that this happens in 15 verses. And to say that he just dropped a bombshell, I would think is probably an understatement. Okay? So let's work through this passage, those 3 phrases. Each announcement that Joseph made is slightly different. Okay? So the first one, he simply says, I'm Joseph, and then asks if his father's alive. We talked about that already. But it seems pretty self-explanatory who he is, doesn't it? I'm Joseph. He didn't think he needed to use his last name. Okay. He didn't need to describe where he was from. I'm Joseph. He doesn't attempt to prove himself. Just simple. I am Joseph. You know what he gets back? Crickets. Okay? It's silent. They just stood there and stared at him. What we're told is that his brothers were terrified. They were frightened. They weren't just afraid. They were speechless. They weren't moving. They said nothing. Think about it. This ruler of the most powerful nation has you in a position of guilt. And Judah's attempting to be a substitute for Benjamin, and all of a sudden he dismisses the servants. What's he going to say? And he breaks down crying so loudly that it was probably like uncontrollable, would be my guess. They're probably standing there going, what in the world is happening here, right? And then he drops the bomb. I'm Joseph. It's the last thing they probably expected to hear. They thought they were in trouble. They thought they were thinking he's going to do something horrible to us. And all of a sudden they find out he's his brother. Wonder what went through their minds when he said that? I've got an idea. We're so dead, right? Oh man. This is not a good situation for them, is probably what they're thinking. They just stood there, unable to say anything. Out of terror. And I would just say, and they should be. Right? Listen, I'm the youngest of 7. If I was ever in a position like this, I would have had a hard time not taking advantage of it, okay? So, says I'm Joseph, asks if his father's alive. They stand there. What's he do next? He says, come close to me. Now, if you like to take notes, this would be a good one to just circle in that passage. It should stand out. There's something special in that statement. Come close to me. He waited until they came close before he said anything else. Come close to me. So what happened? So they came close to him. It's interesting detail, I think. Judah stepped towards Joseph, but that wasn't enough. They drew near to him. Now, I wonder if there must have been something there, right? Distance plays a part in what's going on here. Think about it. He didn't look like Joseph. They would have caught it sooner. He looked like an Egyptian. So I kind of wonder if as they're drawing close, they're like, really? Joseph? Right? Annie got my phone out, and last year, Sabrina was down at the university where I went to, and she found the old yearbooks, and she found a couple pictures of me. It's like 24, 25. She snapped a picture and sent them to Annie. And so I don't know why she brought them. Annie pulled them up last night, and my kids are like, "Doesn't even look like you. You have hair, and it's dark hair even." And so they're looking at me trying to figure out, does that really look like him? 22 years have passed here in Joseph's life. The brothers are like, "Really? I'm Joseph? Is that? But you're bald, right? You dressed all like something else. It's hard to recognize him." And so as they draw close, I would imagine they're kind of working on, is this really him? So they get close. It's a real interesting picture, isn't it? Hey, come in. Now remember, if Joseph is a type of Jesus, I want us to recognize this. language. Because these are the kind of things that Jesus says to us. Draw in close. Come near to me. So they get in close. I'm sure they're nervous. And he says this, his second time that he introduces himself. He says, in case you're curious, I'm your brother Joseph, right? Because I don't know how many Josephs they knew. So I'm your brother Joseph. And just if that isn't enough, he says, the one you sold into slavery, or the one you sold to Egypt. It kind of leaves all doubt out, doesn't it? Joseph, the one that you were horrible to. Now, I think the only detail that he probably left out was he could have said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into slavery, Dad's favorite. Okay? He doesn't say that one, but he could have. Instead, what he says after that statement, because that should be a scary statement. You understand? Your brother Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. It's almost like if you read it, you'd be like, brothers don't do this to each other. You're guilty. And his first statement, after he makes that statement, as he introduces himself, he says, don't be distressed. This is not going the way they would have expected. I am Joseph. Oh, no. Come close. Okay. Joseph, your brother, the one you sold for 20 pieces of silver. And they're like, oh, this isn't good. There might have been a few words coming out of their mouth that weren't good, right? And he goes, don't be distressed. What? Don't be distressed. Joseph quickly wants to dispel their fear. Do you know that it's somewhere around 365 times throughout Scripture that God communicates, don't be afraid? It's probably just a coincidence that there's 365 days in a year, right? Don't be afraid. Draw close to me. Don't be afraid. The angel and Mary, first words, fear not. The angel with the shepherds announcing the birth of Christ, fear not. Jesus, as he appears after the resurrection, don't be afraid. Joseph, as he reveals who he is to his brothers, don't be afraid. Yeah, I'm the one you hated and left for dead. But I'm not holding that against you. This is what he's saying. This is how he's introducing himself the second time he does it. But then he adds this, okay? We can identify with that, right? We can identify. That makes sense. They would be afraid. They should be afraid. That makes sense to them. But then he says, don't be angry with yourselves for selling me here. Now, he's not really talking to Benjamin, but just to his half-brothers, the ones who actually sold him into slavery. But what we see in his words are this, that Joseph has determined from his testing of them, he's seen what's in their hearts. And he knows what they're going to deal with because he's seen what they're dealing with. As that sin, as that guilt has risen up in them, they're dealing with anger towards themselves. They will struggle with horrible guilt from what they have done. For 22 years, they haven't felt guilty, at least not that they showed. But it's all kind of crashing down on them now. And Joseph cares that they're not going to be angry with themselves. Have you ever had a moment where your guilt just kind of all crashed in? Where all of a sudden you're like, oh, I'm such a jerk. I didn't even realize it, right? I've been lying to myself. I've been pretending like it was no big deal. And all of a sudden you realize it's a big deal. Now, maybe I'm the only one like this, but the things that go on in my head are something like this. Oh, you're such an idiot, Darin. What are you thinking? Stupid, stupid, stupid. Okay? There you just had a window into my brain. All right? What we see Joseph doing is he knows this. Hey, don't be angry with yourself. Joseph doesn't want to waste any time. You know how much time is wasted when we can't get over it, our own self? When we can't get past what we've done? It's a waste of time. And Joseph is like, man, I don't want to deal with any of that stuff. Let's get past it. Don't be angry with yourself. He wants to be reconciled with his brothers. He goes on, and he gives God credit. And if you pay attention, in these 3 verses, not only does he introduce himself 3 times to his brothers, but he also gives God credit 3 times. Okay? So 3 times Joseph tells his brothers that God sent him to Egypt to save lives. It's really important that we handle this carefully. All right? Here's why. If we misunderstand what Joseph is saying, if we misunderstand what the passage is communicating, what we will do is we'll misunderstand God's method. If we aren't careful, we can conclude that Joseph is saying, God made you sell me into slavery so that I would be here for this very purpose. Do you hear it? It's very easy to hear that, right? So it's God's fault. If you continue with that thought process, what you do is you come to a conclusion is that, well, God made me God made me sin so that he could accomplish what he wanted to. It was God's idea for us to sell Joseph into slavery. That's not what Joseph was saying. That's a ridiculous way to think of it, but sometimes we do think of that. And oftentimes we blame God for stuff that's our fault. Listen, it's not God's fault. When bad things happen to us, it's because of sin. Maybe it's our sin, maybe it's somebody else's sin, but it's sin. Because of sin. And when something good comes out of it, it's because God made something good come out of it. But don't conclude that God would need us to sin in order to accomplish his will. God doesn't need us to sin in order to accomplish his will. That's not what Joseph is saying. God didn't need the brothers to sell him into Egypt. Think about it. If you think that God needed the brothers to sell him into slavery so that Joseph would be in the right position, then you've made God too small. Let me give you another option. If they didn't sell him into slavery and the famine still came, I think God probably could have provided for them right where they were at. Right? I mean, if God can take Joseph from a servant into prison, out of prison, and to be second in command in all of Egypt, don't you think that maybe he could have just made an oasis in Canaan where Jacob's family was and protected them just as easily? He didn't need them to sin. They sinned and God used it. So what we see in Joseph's words is that Joseph was wanting to remove the fear caused by their guilt. And what we see is a maturity. Because what we see in Joseph is he's able to look at what they've done to him and he can see what God's done with it. Some would call that a divine perspective. Wouldn't it be great if we could get to the place where we can see those types of things? Where we can see the garbage that happens to us. And we can say, look what God's going to do with it, or what God has done with it, or what God wants to do with it. But most of the time, we probably instead just wallow, right? Poor me, why does this have to happen to me? Those are my thoughts. I don't know if you think those things. That's what I do. Okay? I would imagine God's perfect will would have been for his brothers to not actually to sell them into slavery. Now, if you can figure out how somehow God can still have his will accomplished and yet still give you the free will to choose, to make decisions. If you can understand that and comprehend it, man, would you help me get it figured out? Okay? I believe it. I just can't figure out how he does it. I don't know how he can take all things and work them for good of those who love him and who are called according to his purpose. I don't know how he does it, but I know he does. And if I let him, he will always do it. God somehow can remain sovereign. He can be all-powerful and still give us a choice. And in the midst of giving us a choice, he will still be able to accomplish his will. I don't know about you, but that's bigger than my mind can comprehend. That makes his sovereignty even more bigger than I can imagine. Some people believe that his sovereignty means that he's removed the choice from us. And he's just tricked us into thinking that we've made a choice, but it was always the choice that he wanted us to make. Like a giant puppet master. Okay? That's not how God works. But somehow he can take a horrible situation like this and bring something amazing out of it. Does it get much worse than what Joseph went through, honestly? I'm not sure that it could. So Joseph talks about God's purpose. And he tells them it was to preserve a remnant, to save your lives by a great deliverance. Okay? Joseph's words speak here, I think, to a much larger picture. And here's what I mean, okay? I think what Joseph is actually talking about not only about what he's going to do for his family, but I think he's also talking about something that's to come. A great deliverance, what does that sound like to you? What about save a remnant? That language to me sounds more prophetic than anything else. Just for fun, okay? Listen, whenever we get to eschatology, the study of the end time stuff, there's a lot of speculation, okay? But just for fun, let's pretend for a moment. What if Joseph is a type of Christ and his brothers represent the nation of Israel? Okay? I mean, just for fun. The 7 years of famine represent the tribulation. By the way, 7 years of famine, not a coincidence, I don't think. 7 years of tribulation in the scriptures. And what if the brothers coming to find help from Joseph and Joseph eventually revealing himself to them, what if actually that is talking about one day his people realizing who he is? And there being a reuniting. Wouldn't that be cool? Wouldn't that be really cool that what God did with the Jews crucifying Jesus will eventually bring it around to him being in a position to save even them? Doesn't it? I think God's capable of that, don't you? I mean, can you see kind of that parallel or that maybe that's it? I don't know if it is, but it sits in there and I go, looks like that could be it. Especially when he says something like, God's purpose, to save a remnant, to save your lives by a great deliverance. Okay? It seems Joseph is speaking prophetically here. And the next thing he says, as he introduces himself the second time, he says, go tell my father. Go tell my father. Joseph tells the brothers to go tell their father of Joseph's position. That's the word I'm going to pick. Position. Hey, go tell Dad what I've become. where I'm at. Go tell Dad I'm sitting in Egypt on a throne. And then he promises that he wants to take care of, that he's going to take care of them. All right? That's his second introduction to his brothers. Third introduction, that's a little more subtle. We don't have to spend as much time on it, but look at this. He says this, "It is really I who am speaking to you." It's really I who am speaking to you. I'm Joseph. I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. And then he goes, no, look, hey guys, no, it's really me. He's still trying to convince them of who he is. Now, what he's doing when he says this, he's calling on them to remember something. Here's the deal, okay? We go clear back to the first time they came to visit and look for grain. What we're told is that Joseph had an interpreter. So Joseph spoke to his brothers through an interpreter. These guys are all caught up in what's going on. He's dismissed all his attendants. It's just his brothers and him, and he's talking to them. And maybe, just maybe, they haven't figured it out yet that he's talking to them in their native tongue. Okay? And he's like, no, guys, hey, it's me. Notice this. It's really me. Look, I'm talking to you. It's my mouth moving. I'm not using the interpreter. And I wonder if they were like, oh, yeah. Right? It's like one of those movies that starts out in another language and then they just slowly bring it into English and you're like, when did they start speaking English? I don't have to read the subtitles anymore. Okay? And so that we see that they're just so into the situation that they haven't even realized. It would seem as though the brothers are still so stunned that they haven't even realized Joseph is speaking to them in their native language, their native tongue. It's my mouth that's speaking to you. So from there he says, tell my father about the honor. The second time that Joseph instructs his brothers to go back to Dad and tell Dad basically the same thing, right? How do you read that? What's your interpretation of what he's trying to tell them? Is he saying, hey guys, go back and tell Dad how awesome I am, right? Go back and tell Dad, you know that favorite son that you thought was awesome? Well, it turns out he is. Okay? Does that sound like Joseph? No, I don't think so. But what Joseph does here, as he tells them to do this, it's either he's proud of his position or he's continuing to reassure them, his family, that he has forgiven them and he plans to take care of them. What he does when he says this is, listen, Judah, you're going to go home and you're going to say, hey, Dad, we found Joseph. And Dad's going to say, where? Egypt. And he's going to say, how did he get there? And they're going to look at each other like, what do we do now? Awkward, right? That's not going to be good. So what Joseph does is he sets up the conversation. He says, here's what I want you to tell him. Let's not talk about how I got here. Let's not talk to Dad about how I got here. He's going to have a hard time getting past that one. What I want you to do is I want you to focus on where I am and what I can do for you. It kind of lets him off the hook a little bit. Okay. The result, what we see take place, is what Joseph's been hoping for, and it is this: an uninhibited reunion. In other words, he's working at saying, hey guys, let's get past all this garbage. 22 years, I'm so done with it. I just want to be a family again. He has an excuse to be emotional. He has known for some time that these men were his brothers. He's got a hope for something. And what we see come out of it is what he's trying to get. just because he longed for it and just because he revealed himself doesn't guarantee their reaction. Think about it. Think about how guilt can create distance from those that we've wronged. I wish I could say I was a bigger person than this, but when I do something that hurts somebody else, even if it was just thoughtless and I didn't mean to be honest with you, my first reaction is how can I stay away from them? Okay? This is awkward. I'm so embarrassed. I don't know how to get past it. Let's just avoid them. You've probably never been there, right? Driving down the street, oh, there they are. Oh, I got to adjust my stereo. Okay. Oh, somebody better check my phone while I'm driving. It's a good idea. You walk into the grocery store. Oh, I don't want to go down that aisle. Okay. We never do that, do we? Yeah, right. There's distance. Our guilt creates this, causes us to stay away from. What does it do with us and God? I'll tell you what my sin does. It usually makes me hesitant to even talk to him. My sin creates a distance between God and myself. Even though I know he forgives me, I still struggle to draw up close. Look at what Joseph is doing. Hey, come in close. It is only when I get to a point of brokenness that I let down that wall and draw close to him. I wish I was smart enough to figure it out sooner. I wish that I could realize right off the bat, I'm such an idiot. God, I'm sorry. And I wouldn't have to go through this beating myself up. Joseph and Benjamin wept as they embraced. And then Joseph, what does he do? Men, I don't know that this sounds all that appealing, but can we see what the picture is? He went around and he kissed all of his brothers, and he wept over them. And what we're told is, the way it ended is this. Did you catch it? And they sat around and talked together. Do you hear what happened? Is all of this stuff got taken care of, and they were able to sit down and just talk. This is what keeps us from each other. This is what keeps us from God, is all this stuff. And Joseph, as a type of Christ, shows us God's desire is for that, bringing us back together. These brothers came together with all their barriers let down, and they're reunited. That's how the passage today ends with it. Okay, so as we've been working through the Old Testament, we're looking for these places that testify about Christ. And one of those places that testify about Christ is when we find a type of Christ, or a type. And a type is a people, a person, a place, an event, a ceremony. I mean, it's just almost anything, honestly, that points us toward God's redemptive plan. The ark is a type. Did you know that? Not the Ark of the Covenant, but the ark, Noah's ark. Because the ark is the thing that saved Noah and his family through God's destruction. The only thing that saves us is Jesus Christ. Okay? Simple type, right? Okay, so as we look at types, there's more than just types in the scriptures, right? We can read this passage and see so many different things. And so let's not just assume that the only lesson we can get out of a passage in the Old Testament is telling us about Christ, but it does testify to Christ. And so Joseph we see today as the type. It should have been hopefully kind of obvious, right? But what we see is Joseph shows us Jesus' perspective on the crucifixion. Long before we see or read, sorry, there's a missing word there, long before we see or read of his words on the cross. See, Jesus on the cross says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. Because he knew what he was going through had a purpose. And what we see in Joseph is don't be angry with yourself. God had a plan. His plan was to save your lives. God had a plan. His plan was, through Jesus' crucifixion, that we may be saved. What looks like a horrible tragedy, God reveals that he was at work all the time. Somehow, God took Jesus being betrayed by his brothers, literally, right? And killed by his own people, and he is using it to save all of mankind. And we see a very similar thing that Joseph is going through. Joseph's words ring in Jesus' words. Joseph said, it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. Joseph said, it wasn't you that sent me here, that it was God that sent me here. And Jesus says, for God so loved the world that he sent his only son. Jesus made it clear that God sent him with a purpose. Joseph is making it clear. God had a purpose for this. Okay, that's the type. Let's move to application. What do we do with it? And there's multiple things that we can see in the story, but what rose for me is this. Let's go back for a minute. We're looking at the Old Testament. Jesus said, you search the scriptures, thinking in them you're going to find eternal life. But those are the scriptures that testify about me. Yet you refuse to come to me and have life. I've said that a few times, right? Over the last almost year now. Does anyone have it memorized yet? Okay, 2 of you. Good job. All right. Work on it. That's a good one. All right. So where do we find stories of Christ being testified, and then where's the life in it? That's what we're looking for. And what will we do with that? Because I believe God wants us to apply that. So hopefully you can see Joseph expressing forgiveness to his brothers. But what captures my attention, and it captures my attention because this is where I struggle. It's the ending. Now, for lack of a better term, it's a big group hug at the end. Okay? All right? Now, I don't want that to demean or cast the wrong light, because quite honestly, it's actually a really neat thing. Sometimes I'll come up to my wife, Sabrina, and I'll give her a hug. And every once in a while, what'll happen is while I'm hugging her, all of a sudden I get this little cling on. Do you know what I mean? This little kid just clings up to it, and now it's not a hug between Sabrina and myself. It's a hug with one of my kids. And I don't know why, but they really like to press in, almost like try to throw you off balance. But they just want to get real tight in there, right? And sometimes they even want to get in between. And then sometimes what will happen is the next one will join in. And so now there's 4 people hugging, and every once in a while, she's 14 now, so she's way too cool for this, but every once in a while, she'll join in as well, okay? I don't really actually think that's something to be embarrassed about. It is probably one of the greatest moments as a parent. And I want to see what happens with Joseph and his brothers here as one of those awesome moments where they're connected. The barriers have come down, and they're drawing close to each other. See, what happened in the story is restoration. And it's going to continue. This is just the first step in it. But what Joseph does in this restoration of his family, one of the things he does is he tells them, you got to forgive yourself. Now, he doesn't say it in those words. What he says is, don't be angry with yourself, right? But do you hear it? You gotta let it go. Don't be angry with yourself. And the reason I hear it, the reason I see it, is because I get angry with myself. I let myself down all the time. And the worst part is most of those times I let other people down at the same time. And what I tend to do as a mature Christian is I'll do this. Okay? Oh, Lord, I'm sorry. Oh, you idiot. You're so stupid, right? That's me. It creates this distance between God and me. Somewhere along the way, I struggle that if before God will let me in, let me draw close, I got to beat myself up a little bit. I got to make myself pay. I deserve it. But that's not the message we see in Joseph's life. What we see in Joseph's life is, let's move past it. I want the close relationship. Joseph reassures his brothers, God has brought something really good from what you have done. So rather than be consumed with guilt, let's embrace what he wants to accomplish. And I think what happens is if we can grab a hold of that, and we can start to think that, yeah, we blew it, but God's bigger than this, and I'm going to trust that he can bring something good out of it. And when that happens, it spills out into the relationships around us. God's whole concern is relational. Death is separation from God. So if death equals separation from God, what does closeness with God equal? Cliff, you got it? Life, right? Life, right? If being away from God is death, then being close to God is life. Where's the life in the story? Do we see the life in the story is when the brothers can sit down and have a conversation together. When they know who he is, when it's all done, and they've moved past being angry with themselves. Once he reveals himself, the struggle starts to come up. We've been a horrible people. Brothers hesitate. And so Joseph encourages them to draw close. Don't be afraid. Recognize God was able to use their sin to bring something good. Not everybody's like me. Okay? And if you're not one that beats yourself up over your sin, good job. Okay? But those of us that do, we need to see what happens in the story. That Joseph encourages them to get past this so he can take care of them. His goal, his desire is to be together with them and to take care of them. So he's telling them, you need to forgive yourself. Nope, it's not found in Scripture. To forgive yourself, that phrase is not anywhere in Scripture. Okay? Well, the Bible says you need to forgive yourself. Well, not technically. But the Bible does say, stop being angry with yourselves for selling me into slavery. Okay? So what does it look like to forgive ourselves? Well, I found this quote. It's found in gotquestions.com. It's a biblically based website. There's great answers in there. What I appreciate about it is how much they use Scripture. I don't always agree with everything that they write, but I can't refute the fact that the way they pull the Scriptures in. This is what it says. Oddly enough, forgiving yourself means admitting your own sinfulness. It requires admitting that we are imperfect and unable to become perfect on our own. Sometimes we think that's what we have to do. Become perfect on our own. He gave us his Spirit to do that in us. We need to let him do it because that's what he wants to do. It means acknowledging the depth of our depravity. It means rejecting the idea that our efforts will ever atone for our wrongdoings. But it also means receiving and walking in the fullness of God's grace. When we humble ourselves and receive God's grace, we can let go of our own angst against ourselves for our wrongs. Maybe I'm not the only one that struggles with this, huh? We come to understand that the creator of the universe loved us so much that he not only made us, but overcame our rebellion against him. God overcame your rebellion against him. Don't be angry with yourself. Draw in close. Let him take care of you. Now that's a long quote. Okay? So here's my short one. Ready? If God can forgive you, then so can you. Will you see the way Joseph encourages his brothers to draw close and let go of their guilt? Is the same way that Jesus speaks to us in regards to our sin. It shouldn't be too big of a stretch, as Joseph is a type of Christ in the story. Would you pray with me, please?